call to order our work session on the Port of Anchorage. We'll begin with introductions of Assembly members and then of our august head table over there. Mr. Birch.
Chris Birch. Patrick Flynn.
Jennifer Johnson.
Mr. Trainee is here, as well as Mr. Steele, Mr. Honeman, Ernie Hall.
Amy Demboski.
Ron Hadden, purchasing officer.
Robert Owens with the Department of Law.
George Fakalish, municipal manager.
Dan Sullivan, Mayor.
Rich Wilson, Port Director. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Very good. I'm going to open up with just some general comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to George to talk about some of the recent reports that we've received and also the RFP that we've developed. As you all know, we've been working for the last several years to get the port project back on the right tracks. When we came into office, it was soon discovered that the construction had gone in the wrong direction, and we spent the next several years determining what the extent of the damage was and examining whether or not the design itself was appropriate, and then developing the criteria by which we would move forward, which includes us taking over direct management of the project rather than MARAD, the Maritime Administration. We're at a point now where we're feeling very, very confident that with the introduction of the RFP that they will talk about, that we'll get a top professional team on board to help guide the project going forward. But ultimately, this will be a project that's guided by the municipality, which is something that probably should have happened a number of years ago. But we're not looking backwards at this stage, we're looking forward. I think we have garnered quite a bit of confidence from both the state administration and the legislature. As you know, in the last year in 2012, they between the direct grant and the bond that passed, basically we've received another $100 million towards this project, which with the $30 million still in reserve, we have $130 million by which we can now launch forward. Not enough to certainly complete the project, but really do appreciate the fact that the state government has expressed confidence in this administration's approach to getting this project going in the right direction. I think we're real close to having some very, very good progress going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Municipal Manager.
Well, thank you. Jennifer had asked me to make sure that we covered three things. The mayor did indicate that we would be covering three things, but let me be very, very specific. The Inspector General audit of MARAD is one, and I'll start with that. The second one that we'll be covering is the forensic audit that we had requested to take a look at the CH2M Hill evaluation of the project. And then the third is the RFP itself for project management team. Let me just explain the Inspector General process, and I know that there's at least three of us in this room that's very, very familiar with it from past experiences. But bottom line is, when the Inspector General goes in, they have been given guidance as to what focus they are to take and exactly what to look at. They go in, they look at it, they come up with their initial conclusions, and in some regard recommendations. They then go back to the interested party, and the interested party in this case is MARAD. They go back to MARAD and they say, MARAD, this is what our initial findings are, these are our initial recommendations, give us your comments. So that's the opportunity for MARAD or any other entity in the federal government that's involved in an IG inspection to come back and say, finding number one is faulty because of these reasons. Finding number three is partially right, but finding number four, you completely forgot to look at this. So they have the opportunity during this process, in which they had quite a few months, by the way, to go ahead and go through this process and then refute the report. It then goes back to the IG. The IG takes a look at all of these comments, and they'll either incorporate them as a matter of fact and finding and change their original findings, or they'll just mention it, but their findings will remain the same. So in this particular case, that process occurred. The comments from MARAD were looked at, but the findings that they found was substantiated. So in other words, what you have in front of you is the findings of the IG after comments from MARAD. They do make mention of some comments that MARAD made, but they also are very clear in what their findings are. So what I'd like to do is just very briefly, just cover what the substantial findings were. In your packets, you do have the actual IG report. You may have gotten it before, but you certainly have it now. And all I'm going to basically do is just cover a couple pages here. The first page that I'm going to be covering is basically page number 2, where it says results of the brief. If you go further into the book, and we've taken the opportunity to actually take extracts that has the specific findings and all of the details relevant to that finding, if you want to basically take a look at it later. So finding number 1, MARAD did not establish effective oversight mechanisms when it initiated its port infrastructure development responsibilities. It goes on further in the meat of the book there to explain what they're talking about, but the bottom line is they did not effectively manage or set up the procedures or the mechanisms to make sure that proper management was taken care of. MARAD narrowly interpreted the statutory requirements which state that appropriated amounts of the Port of Anchorage and Hawaii Harbor's projects will be transferred to and administered by the Maritime Administration. What they're saying there is that the Maritime Administration did not properly interpret exactly what that meant. In the law that was passed by Congress, the interpretation as pertained by the audit says that MARAD will administer and is responsible for the funds and the project. What that means is they're responsible for the overall management of the project. MARAD's interpretation was all we have to do is keep track of the money and transfer the funds. That was their interpretation. It also says that they failed to establish a sound risk management process consistent with industry best practices. They certainly did not do that. It also says in here that they did not provide for a project management plan, which is a requirement. Now, any project, you do establish a project management plan, just like a risk management plan. And they said that they failed to have a process to systematically store, maintain, track project progress and funds. So in other words, they did not have a management system or any type of a data collection system that could manage any one of these transactions that were occurring, to include fund management. Further, on page 3 of the report, they say, MARAD did not effectively manage its port project contracts. They, as the contracting entity, were responsible for overseeing and managing all the contracts that were in place that they had issued. They failed to do that properly. They further say that we found that the Port of Anchorage project also had significant contract problems stemming from MARAD's inadequate planning, lack of reliable cost estimates, and noncompliance with federal contracting requirements. So basically, throughout this process, they never really did clearly define what the cost estimates were for each one of the tasks that were assigned to the contractor. They did not properly manage those costs, and as a result, obviously the costs kept climbing and climbing throughout the process. And they did not follow FAR, the federal acquisition regulations, in their procurement of contracts. On page number 4, it says, because MARAD awarded contracts for these projects, MARAD is responsible for contract oversight and compliance with relevant contracting laws and regulations. Very, very clear. And they failed to do that. But the audit points out that that's what they should have done, because that's what they were required to do. And then there's one other section that I wanted to point out to you, and it's found on page number 15. And on 15, in the middle way down, it says, MARAD, and basically when MARAD responded back to the IG, that's what they're referring to. MARAD also pointed to the 2003 Memorandum of Agreement, which states that the municipality was responsible for providing overall program requirements and direction to MARAD. Nevertheless, once the agency decided to award a federal contract for the Port of Anchorage project, it became responsible for ensuring that federal acquisition rules were followed and for providing adequate planning, estimating, and oversight of the contract. Now, we have been saying that all along. We have been saying that all along, We've been saying that when we even looked at the memorandum of agreement that they referred to in 2003. It was vague, it was not clear, but we have been saying that that is the genesis of where the problem originated, and that's the genesis of the problem today. They failed to properly recognize what their responsibility was, and when they acknowledged that they had certain responsibilities, they failed to comply with federal regulations, nor did they adequately oversee the contracts and the port project itself. So that's the genesis of, and that is the nuts and bolts of what the IG report says. And again, we're glad that the IG came in and took a look at it, because it certainly helps substantiate future actions on our part. Any questions on that?
Yes, Mr. Flynn.
So what? I mean, great, we have somebody else we can blame for our problems. I mean, I noticed somebody underlined the copy that was printed for us, section you didn't cover. We found merit added contrary to the intent of the SBA's program by steering Port of Anchorage, the first Port of Anchorage contract to the port's preferred firm. I mean, I get it. People screwed up. Can we take that off the table and move forward? I think the problem that you're getting us into now, moving forward, is we're pursuing litigation when the IG's report points the finger back at us just as much as it points at Merit. So, I mean, it's a statement, not a question. I'm sorry, but I don't think I agree with your assessment of this report.
Okay, well, my mission in life was to basically convey to you the report as we see it. That's what we've done. The next item, are there any other questions, Mr. Chair?
I don't see any other.
And we would disagree with the assessment that it points the finger as much at us as it does at Marriott. In fact, if you read through the whole report, quite the opposite. It's very, very critical of Marriott. Marriott does not get to assign their responsibilities and then say, you're to blame because I didn't do my job. That's the bottom line.
Mr. McCabe?
Yes. Next is the forensic report that we received regarding the CH2M Hill report that was provided to us. And Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heiger is the company that basically went in and did the forensic audit. As you remember, we requested them to take a look at the CH2M Hill report. There was concerns on all of our parts that we had two reputable firms basically saying two different things, and as a result of that, we felt it would be very prudent so that we could understand what the actual nature of the problems were, and to verify whether or not the CH2M Hill report was correct or not. We hired an outside forensic firm to take a look at it. You also have copies of that. You've been briefed on it, but basically there is probably three fundamental issues here. One certainly is that the analysis used by P&D engineers is insufficient since it failed to adequately consider the shape of the potential failure slip surface. Two, that the method used by P&D to estimate the shear strength of the soil needed to verify global stability is insufficient since it failed to adequately consider the full extent of the directional dependence on the shear strength of the Bootlegger Cove formation clay stratum. And three, that each of these aforementioned instances, CH2M Hill used an approach that is consistent with the standard of practice. So basically what happened was that in the engineering from P&D, they failed to look at two major things. They did look at the circular aspect of the dynamics of stability as it relates to some type of seismic event, but they failed to look at all the other dynamics of the movement. And as a result of that, by oversimplifying their analysis, they failed to look at some of the very key objects that causes instability in a structure when you have a seismic event. The other thing that was pointed out was that even the global stability, I just mentioned seismic, but even global stability. Now, global stability is the stability of the infrastructure relative to normal day-to-day use. Even under that, they did not properly estimate what the ability of that structure would be for day-to-day operations. So it failed in that regard too. So those are the two major failings as far as the design of the project. And as you remember, those are the things that was pointed out by CH2M Hill. There was other things in the CH2M Hill that was pointed out. You know, they also looked at the construction and all of that. We did not ask these folks to look at that. We were concerned with the design because we need to know a way forward, and we wanted to find out exactly what was the design flaws, if any, in the previous design. So that's pretty much what this report says. It also further at the end, at the very, very end, it also explains in more detail what those points are.
And it should be noted as well that they go on to say that P&D and CH2M Hill did use different design parameters, different values, but they came to their conclusion regardless of the values that each individual engineering firm used. So the differentiation in values in their calculations really didn't factor into their final conclusion about the global stability and seismic stability.
Any questions? Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I guess my initial thought is, okay, have we identified the way forward?
Yes.
And when will we get an idea?
That's my next point.
Okay.
The RFP we'll discuss next. As you remember in the CH2M Hill presentation, when they put forth a number of options about designs that would meet the seismic and global stability requirements going forward, and narrowed it down to 3 options, and our goal with the new project management team is to narrow it down into a final option.
Thanks. No questions, Mr. Michaelis?
Okay, so we have been working for some time now on a request for proposals. And this request for proposal is for basically a project management team. And it's a full-service project management team. And the project management team will be the Municipality of Anchorage's representative. In other words, they work for us, and they're to look out for our well-being on this project. And it's a full service, which means they also not only have engineering capabilities, they also have the ability to oversee construction, and they also have the ability to do all of the administrative functions associated with the project. I'll go through some of those. The project, basically, the RFP calls for a 5-year contract with two-year extension periods. So it's a total of 9 years. The total dollar amount of this contract is $54 million. And the way that that's broken down, it's $30 million for the first 5 years, and it's 12 years for each 2-year extension, not to exceed $54 million. Now, on the, and you do not have this, it will be posted on the website. It is to be released today, and so it will be in detail on the website. But I will highlight a couple of the main areas on here so that you know what this contract basically entails. As I mentioned, it's a full service project management team. That team will be responsible for providing staff and project management office locally, so they have to be on site. They have to be responsible for the day-to-day supervision and oversight of the project. That was different than the MARAD contract, because MARAD for years did not have anybody on site other than, quote, the contractor who also was acting as the project manager. Second, they'll be responsible for developing and maintaining a comprehensive project management plan. Now, you've heard that name before because that was also a finding in the IG report, that there was not a project management plan. And it goes into great detail as to what that consists of. But let me highlight a few things. A time management plan, a cost management plan, a resource management plan, a human resource management plan. It also requires for a change management plan. It also requires a risk management plan. Now, most of those things you also were also pointed out in the internal audit, the Inspector General audit, rather. They have a data management plan that they're required to put together. That is to capture all the data, to make sure it's documented, it's archived, and it can be retrieved whenever you need it. So that was not done in the previous portions of the project. They're also required to develop an overall master project schedule. And when I say that they're required to develop these, they develop them, we have to approve them, but they're responsible for development. And I'll explain to you why that's critical later. They're also responsible for developing and maintaining a project baseline budget with cash flow estimates. And at any one time, we should be able to go to them, and they should be able to show us exactly how much money's been spent and what they've got in the works to be spent. And I'll explain how that process is going to work in a few minutes as well. The project management team will produce monthly schedules and budget status reports to the MOA Executive Committee. So there will be an MOA Executive Committee, and that committee will be responsible for overseeing the efforts of the project management team. And I'll explain the composition of that committee in a minute. Review and advise the municipality of Anchorage on the interim cost estimates and invoicing by consultants and contractors. So in other words, we have a task that goes out, someone says that task is going to cost X. They have to come to us and say, we believe that this is appropriate or it's not appropriate, and then we'll be the final arbiter or the decision maker as to that's the appropriate cost for that particular task that's issued. All of the different items that will be tasked out will be done on a task order basis. So in other words, if you want widget A to be moved to widget B, there'll be a written document that says that's the task, and it'll have all of the different criteria and requirements in that task. The individual moving it will give us a cost as to what that's going to cost, and we either validate it, don't validate it, or negotiate it. There will be a comprehensive risk mitigation program in this project. Now, the risk mitigation program that we're talking about is a little different than risk mitigation that you may be thinking of. One of the faults of the original organization of the port and the oversight was they did not have a risk management plan. So what is the risk management plan that I'm talking about? It's a plan where you look at different alternatives. For example, as you're building something, something comes up and you may have to make a decision that's a little bit different than what you anticipated at the beginning. So what you do is you look at, okay, if we make a decision that goes this way, what risk are we going to encounter? Is there going to be a risk that we're going to bust the time schedule? Is there a risk, and what's the order of magnitude of that risk? Is there a risk that the cost is going to be extremely higher than what we anticipated? What's the order of magnitude of that risk? And you go down through all of this risk analysis, and then you make a conscious decision as to whether or not you want to go forward with that particular approach or not. So every aspect that you looked at is looked at a risk basis. And then the overall risk is, when this is said and done, this particular aspect that you're looking at, is it exactly what you want? And will it do what you want it to do? And so you assign a risk associated with that. And that's how you come up with your decision-making matrix on these type of projects. And that's what was failed to be done in the previous go-around. And again, I'm just highlighting them. There is about 5 pages worth of tasks that they're proposing on. And the reason it has to be very, very detailed is because they have to understand what they could be tasked to do. And therefore, when they submit to us their proposals based on their qualifications and how they understand this and how they would approach this, they also have to submit to us separately their costs. And that's why it's extremely important that every task that we could think of, major task, is identified in here in detail. Develop and maintain an electronic document management system. That was not done before. This will have to be done for an awful lot of reasons. One is you also have to be able to, at any point in time, be able to enter into and get the data that you need as to what decisions were made, why they were made, what correspondence was made between the contractor and the project management team, what guidance, what was the actual task order, and what comments was made as a result of that task when they were in the field trying to develop it. So all of this information has to be properly documented and put in a manner that you can find it. As you know, we found that during the last process, there was all kinds of communications going between the subcontractors to the contractor to ICRC, in some cases from ICRC to MARAD, which we were never privy to. And some of that was very, very important information. And we never found it until after we started going through and requiring the contractor at the end of the contract period to pull everything that they possibly had for communications. And God only knows what we don't know, but we got an awful lot of it. This precludes that from happening. We will have it, it will be documented who saw what, when they saw it, and what decisions were made based on what they saw. Provide assistance and support in working with the MOA to resolve claims from the different vendors, and that's what I had mentioned before about if the vendor says or the contractor said it's going to cost you for this change, then that has to be verified. The project management team is going to have to verify it and give us a recommendation, and then the executive committee will decide whether or not it will be honored. And there's several others, but one other one that I want to point out that I think is very important. We've never done that on a project here before. I have done it before on projects, and it does work very, very well. That is that no matter what type of project you have, you always have the risk of some type of dispute. And you always want to have a process in place to be able to resolve those disputes. There's all kinds of mechanisms out there. You know, you certainly have mediation, arbitration, you can go to court, but there's a step that you can take before that that works very, very well. And that is you basically form a dispute resolution board. And this dispute resolution board is basically comprised of experts in the field and their peers. Their peers to the different type of work that is being done on the site. And if there is a dispute where the executive committee, the project manager and the contractor disputes the charges, the work, whatever it is, then it can be forwarded by the executive committee to this dispute resolution board. They will come up with a recommendation. They're not an arbitrator, but they are a recommender. And what's great about that is that in most cases, when the contractor sees that their peers either agree or don't agree with what they're saying, then everybody pretty much falls in line with what that recommendation is. And the reason is that if it's ever disputed in a higher court, you've got experts on the site, independent experts that's looked at it, and they've come up with what their recommendation is. So that's in there. Now, what specifically are we really asking this team to do in addition to all of these things? We want them to look at the options that were provided to us. And as you know, there was 3 options that was provided to us from CH2M Hill as to how to go forward. This team will take a look at option 5, and if you remember, option 5 was basically just taking the existing dock and reinforcing it right where it is today. Or 5 hotel, which in the report and in the recommendations was moving the dock out so it's more in line with where we extended the ground out into the inlet. And it called for putting a dock on the north end. That was option 5 hotel. But they're also being asked to really evaluate, and the emphasis, and I say the emphasis, to really evaluate another option that's a hybrid. And that is 5 hotel minus the dock to the north. So 5 hotel minus the dock to the north. So they're going to look at a new dock out front where the existing docks are, concentrating on the south. So what that means is that as opposed to having to move one of the carriers to the north end onto that new dock to provide ample room to go ahead and work on terminals 2 and 3 and move them out, what this calls for is moving them to the south. Now, what's the advantage to that? There's a lot of advantages. First of all, it certainly is less inconvenient for the 2 major carriers. It certainly cuts the cost of the project down because you don't have to put a dock to the north. It does create some very distinct challenges in basically doing the schedule. But we're asking them to go ahead and do that and to look at every aspect and as to how we can make that happen. Because quite frankly, that will probably be the cheaper of all the different options available right now.
Yeah, and just let me interject there. One of the reasons that I've asked the team to look at that third option is because in the plan that CH2M Hill proposed, the 5 hybrid option, you're building a new dock to the north that the current carriers don't want to use, and it's a $375 million price tag, and so you're spending that amount of money without any improvements to the dock as it exists today. So I want to look at the option of not only fixing the serviceable dock that we have today, but moving it out to the 45-foot mark like 5 hybrid proposes. And so you get the best of both worlds. You get the deeper draft, you're fixing the dock that is the serviceable dock today, and then in the future, if there's a need for a new dock to the north, then that could be your last phase or a future phase. So I'm worried about the amount of money that we'll be able to obtain, and to spend $375 million and not have touched the main dock, I think would be a little challenging. But as George said, that option also presents some challenges with ice and sedimentation and other things. So it's going to be interesting to see how they respond to that.
That's kind of it in a nutshell, but I would encourage you to go ahead and read it when it's published so that you can see all of the things that we're asking them to do. I feel very confident that this has been well laid out, and I say that, I don't say it because of any personal interest in it. I say it from a professional point of view. It will help us because it's a good document, it's a good roadmap going forward, and it sets the stage for the project.
Thanks. I have in the queue Mr. Flynn, Mr. Johnston, Mr. Trainee, and Mr. Hall. Mr. Flynn?
Well, first off, Mr. Chair, I think it's fair for us to let our colleagues know that yourself, Ms. Johnson, and myself all had the opportunity to review this RFP in advance of its release. And I thank you for that.
For full disclosure, in our enterprise committee meeting with the port, that was set up in the committee meeting. So it was
And we,
on our,
I know you offered a couple comments. I know I offered a few. Most of them, I think, were incorporated in the final document, not all. But I personally have never done that before as an assembly member. I've never gotten into the procurement process in advance of the release. And extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. So I would emphasize Mr. Michaelis' point that I think it's important for each of us to review that RFP while it's on the street, because there's going to be a meeting in about 3 weeks.
2 to 3 weeks.
2 or 3 weeks, Mr. Head, where contractors will come in and ask questions that will ultimately clarify what the RFP says. And I think it behooves us to try and get our questions in at the same time so that we're comfortable when that award comes before us that we are getting what we really want. This one's a little bit too important just to approve it on the consent agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Ms. Johnston?
actually, you already said what I was going to say.
Mr. Trainee?
What do you envision the Assembly's role in this? Are we going to have a delegate on this executive committee? Because the Assembly's been so distanced from this whole port project, I don't care who the mayor was. We've seen this since it came in. I want to make sure the Assembly's involved in every aspect of this.
So what I had been asked by Chairman Hall as well as Ms. Johnson is that we will give you periodic updates as to exactly what's going on in the project, any problems we're having, all the good things that's happening as well, where we are as far as the budget, or any unforeseen things that may be very relevant for all of us to be aware of. And I was asked to do that, so that certainly will be done. We, on the executive committee itself, just so that you know the composition, there'll be myself, there'll be the purchasing director, there'll be the port director, there'll be the port engineer, and there'll be from our project management and engineering, there'll be project manager on there as well. We'll also have a legal member from our own in-house attorney's office, and that will be Bob. In addition to that, we can add, or we can add one or two other members. There's been some suggestions, and I know that the mayor's taken that under advisement as to the possibility of one or two other members on there. So that's where we're at on that. I don't know that it's a good idea for the assembly itself to sit on it, but I do agree with you, the assembly needs to be informed throughout, periodically, as to what's going on. And the reason I don't know that it's a good idea for the assembly to sit on it, because if there's any type of controversy or anything else, the assembly needs to be an impartial body and stay away from it. That's why the assembly in the past has not been in that role.
Thank you, George.
We provide quarterly updates to the legislature since they've been our major funding source, and so we'd anticipate that that would broaden out to include certainly the assembly with periodic reports.
Mr. Honor?
Just a few questions here. Being that the mayor just answered part of it, which, is there any federal funding left, and do we anticipate MARAD having any more connectivity with federal funding going forward on our project?
So right now, all the federal funds have been spent. All of the audit and everything else is pretty much confirmed that the federal funding has been expended that was allocated for this project. We do have $132 million, and that is made up of some monies from the port revenues, but the majority of that is monies from state grants. So primarily what we're working with today is state grant money and port funds. That does not mean that there won't be federal funds in the future, but it does mean that all of the monies that we have right now today, we are in control of. It does not have to be funneled through MARAD. If we were to receive federal funds, then either MARAD or some other federal lead would basically have to issue the checks. In other words, verify that the money's being spent.
And use the
what we say.
FARs and all the things that were identified wasn't done properly.
That's correct, okay. But right now, we have no federal funds available that we know of, but we're gonna continually to apply for grants and things like that. But right now, all we're working with is state and local money.
And the second question is, and I think it goes along with what Mr. Flynn was talking about, and I recognize, of course, the Assembly's precarious position, but it was telling that when the information from MARAD and the investigation started going into the what went wrong phase, I went to an enterprise committee meeting at the port, and the port commission was there, and a lot of those members of the port commission had no clue. So are we going to keep them advised, surprised, and are they going to have a role here?
They will also be advised and kept up to date as to the progress of the port construction, yes.
And then lastly, along that question, which strikes to the point of, healthy future, regardless of who's sitting here, who's sitting there, doesn't matter. Down the road, this is not going to be one of those things that gets done overnight. So that no decisions are made in vacuums, and certainly we don't have the problems that go left, right, or whatever, and trying to figure out later, again, once what went wrong. Stakeholders committee, for instance, people that are very invested in the port with their businesses, are there going to be meetings, or are they going to have a seat at the table?
The project manager that we hire is required to get with the stakeholders and go back through and work with them on what their recommendation to us is going to be as to how to make the 5 hotel to the south work. So they'll be working with them exclusively to make sure that we can make this thing work and that they all agree how we can do this.
As I did here.
And they also.
There's a legitimate possibility that the project management firm will come back to us and say, the ideas you put out are okay, but we think something different is better.
That's what I'm saying.
And that'll be based on that consultation with stakeholders.
And that's because I've heard a lot, an earful from stakeholders that are saying concern about that one, I think was addressed, going to the north, okay, but what now? There's money over here to build, what's gonna take place of where we really wanna be and where we're practically using. So I think we're in the right direction. I agree with Mr. Flynn's assessment from earlier, and I think there's a lot of finger pointing, but we can do that until the cows come home. It doesn't fix us our port.
There's one other thing that I did not mention, but I think is important. We are going to ask this project management team, and it's in here, to tell us what they think, or to recommend to us what they think is the best method of delivery for this project. And as you know, there's three basic methods of delivery. You can do a design bid build, you can do a design build, or you can do a GCCM, where basically the contractor and the design team is all one. They work together, they've been hired at the same time, they work together. And so that when that design is completed, that contractor says, I can build it. It's buildable, I can build it, I can build it for this. So they're gonna be asked to give us a recommendation as to which method of delivery is the best, and if necessary, depending on phases of the project, because they also will be recommending as to how to do these phases. It could be that one method of delivery is good for one phase, but a different method of delivery is better for another phase. And so that's all part and parcel as to what their recommendation to us will be. So, you know, we're very hopeful and excited about getting a real good project management team on board.
Ms. Johnston?
Just to sort of follow up as far as the Port Commission and their involvement. I think we all know that this is really the initial phase, and it's what we're gonna do to go forward, but then we have to address financing. And I don't think we'll be looking at the full granting of the port that we had thought of at one point. And the Port Commission they set the tariffs. So there's gonna have to be some interaction and some, you know, it's gonna, and that's also the stakeholders, because the stakeholders are paying the tariffs. So that's when we start getting into layers of accountability and cross-check, and there will be involvement, no matter who of us are standing around. And I'd like to say, no matter who's the mayor, this is a municipal project, and so it's gonna require a strong mayor to actually be heading the project and be at the table.
One of the things we're going to do, once the team is selected, is we're going to sit down with the governor, with the commissioner of DOT, with ADA, with HFC, with commission members, and just really look at that financing picture going forward. You know, there's been lots of different suggestions on how to proceed, even P3 partnerships, and we want to make sure that we're all at the table to figure out how this most important project gets financed to completion, and get everybody on board so that there is not only a game plan of how to design it and how to build it, but how to finance it.
Any other questions? Gentlemen, thank you for the presentation. We're adjourned.